Leo Michel has worked during more than 17 years in the office of the Secretary of Defense. He was responsible for policy formulation and advice to the Secretary. So, without further ado, please welcome Leo Michel.
Take a deep breath. I'm not here to recruit you for the U.S. Army. And while I realize that this has a bit of a martial tone to it, as you'll see, I hope in my remarks, I'm not here only to talk about what the military does. What's the U.S. plan here? The U.S. plan is to have what we're calling persistent presence, so that there's a continuous rotation of these U.S. forces. These are at modest levels, but they send a very powerful message. What are they doing? They're conducting exercises and training that improve the interoperability of our military with the militaries there. They're sending a presence message, and this is very useful, frankly, for the U.S. military. We have captains who are company commanders who are being greeted by the president or minister of defense of the country where they're landing. We're learning a lot about the real situation. It's one thing to have plans off in NATO somewhere or in U.S. European Command headquarters. It's another thing to know, well, on this particular road, once you're there, you find out it can't actually support the weight of a tank. At the Wales Summit, which took place last September, there was agreement on several additional long-term measures. One of them is to create what's called a spearhead force. It's actually a part of what already existed called the NATO Response Force. What's different about it, it's not only multinational, so is the NATO Response Force, but it's a brigade, which means it's going to be about 5,000 troops. It's going to have an air component. It could have sea enablers if necessary, special forces, ready to move. An important question, of course, is why are we doing all of this? The most obvious reason is the Russian aggression that we've seen taking place against Ukraine. I don't think we should mince words about this. You are talking about one country moving in militarily and taking over and annexing the sovereign territory of a neighbor. By our forward presence in Europe, we are able to train and exercise and have intellectual operability with our allies. We need to ensure that the next generation understands this as well. Maybe not exactly in the same way, but understands how important the transatlantic bond is. Every few years, the White House releases a national security strategy. And in this year's national security strategy, where they're talking about Asia Pacific, they remind readers that over the next 5 years, nearly half of all the growth outside of the United States is going to come from Asia.
Is it smart? Do you think it's smart to let Chancellor Merkel and President Hollande negotiate with Putin while the Obama administration is taking a back seat, leading from behind? Is that the way to operate in the case of Russia?
And the U.S. leading from behind, I think it's a misnomer. I mean, that was mentioned by one unnamed official. I don't know who it was in the White House during the Libya campaign. And it's factually wrong. The United States was in on the strikes. We provided a tremendous amount of refueling, of intelligence assistance. We were in the game at every level.
Now turn to you in the audience. If you have questions,
feel free to disagree as well, or have an opinion.
You mentioned that some people think that weak and isolated Russia is something and is having its risks. So this idea puts, in my view, Europe and US as well, kind of in a trapped situation, like when it's afraid to undertake further steps, not to further irritate Russia, while Russia, on its part, is going further.
And the combination of the EU and US sanctions, which are not only on individuals anymore, but also concern Russian entities, concern bans on transfer technology for energy exploitation and so forth, that these are having a real effect. They're probably not the only reason why the Russian ruble has dropped so low and other things.
Being a Russian, I'm obliged to ask this question. In your presentation, you said that there is a physical presence of Russians in Ukraine. However, you didn't mention about the physical presence of Americans in the same place, which we always see in non-American media, and they always find a lot of proof to that. How do you comment that?
There aren't. We've postponed what was intended to be a battalion size, a battalion of several hundred, training exercise with Ukrainian National Guard. This would have been in far west of Ukraine, but actually almost at the border with Poland. We've had a very public debate, which is not solved yet. I mean, at least the president hasn't made a decision about whether or not to provide a limited amount of defensive weapons to Ukraine so that they can protect their own territory.
How far should NATO be willing to go in protecting Ukraine's sovereignty? And the introduction of the military or the weapons would only be one step, or at least I think it should be part of a further escalation plan on NATO's part, should they introduce it. And do you think they would be willing to go as far as starting war or contributing with military troops in Ukraine in securing it?
We have an important commitment to each other in defense of each other as allies, but that does not extend to Ukraine, and there's absolutely no consensus on that. NATO as an organization does not provide arms to anyone. That would be a decision that would be taken by individual countries. Maybe the US, if that's the decision, would be the only one. Maybe a few others would. Maybe some countries that recently have been critical of the idea may decide in light of the Russian actions there, they're not going to do it, but they're not going to criticize either.
Told the audience, listen, I am from Europe, where the history comes from. Now, what I really hope is that something that won't happen when you go back to the United States in maybe 3 or 4 days, that you come home and you say, honey, I'm back from history. Because I hope that you still see a future for us, for the alliance, because there's a compelling reason for Europe and the United States to hold on to each other. Thank you very much for your thoughtful observations. I thank the audience for your questions and your patience.